Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and taking the time to join our latest webinar on the run-up to the Sustainable Foods Conference next January. We're going to be diving into a real key area facing food systems on the financing angle towards future food systems. As a quick refresher, the webinar, as I said, is in lieu of the Sustainable Foods Conference, which is fast approaching, and we have a world-class esteemed speaker line, which I'm just going to share for you all now to have a quick view in terms of who is currently confirmed that's going to be there. We are also working with the UK government and DEFRA for the conference. So I do encourage everyone who is watching to get in touch with me or anyone who's keen to hear more about the conference itself next January. I will be sharing also a code for you all to register at the end, which I will then be sharing via email. So once again, please do join us in January. And lastly, before I hand over to Louis, who's going to be taking us through the next 55 minutes, please do pose as many questions as you can in the Q&A box at the bottom. We want to have a very lively, spirited debate on financing food systems. So thank you all for taking time to join us, and I'll hand over to Louis now. Over to you, Louis.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm Louis, and I lead the membership at Future Food Movement, where we work directly with leadership teams across now about 75% of the UK food industry. And from those ESG and innovation to finance and board level teams, we help turn their intent into commercial delivery through strategy, insights, and upskilling of their teams. Today's conversation is, I think one of the most urgent and uncomfortable questions that we keep coming across in that journey. Who pays? Who pays for the transition? We all know, and I think if you're on this call today, we all know that the system needs to change. But so often the financial incentives are still pointing in the wrong direction for them to spin back the other way. What needs to change? And here talking, about farming, but also the food industry. I read a report last week from the World Economic Forum that estimates that the global agri-food system needs over $1 trillion of investment every year for the next 5 years to stay within climate limits. And for farmers in Europe, another report by Deloitte last week puts the upfront transition costs between 2,000 and 5,000 euros per hectare. And even with the available incentives, the funding gap can still reach over 4,000 euros per hectare. So this session is more about the cost. I think it's also about value and risk and the mechanics of who shoulders what within the value chain. So over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to try and even scratch the surface of that big topic and look at where investment is already happening and where it's blocked, what new models are starting to work, and how we design a food industry that shares cost and reward more fairly from field to finance. Joining me, three brilliant panelists. We've got Owen Bethell, Global Public Affairs Lead for Environment at Nestle, brings a commercial lens from inside one of the world's largest food companies. We've got Katrina Hayter, Global Head of Sustainable Land Use and Supply Chains at HSBC, leads efforts to align finance and food system transformation. And then we also have Patrick Holden, Executive Director of Sustainable Food Trusts, one of the most respected voices in farming. And Patrick, we're going to come to you first. Is it correct that it's currently more profitable to farm extractively? And if so, what do we need to do to change that? Just a small question to get us started. Patrick, you're on mute. There we go.
Partner, I'm with you now.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So I would say it is. This question, I'm at the Cool Farm conference in just south of Bristol. I've been here this morning, and exactly that question came up because somebody said, oh, if you transition to regenerative farming, there's a dip in yields and profitability for a few years, and then it's all back to, you actually do better than before. Well, I'm in my 52nd year, but I would like to say my aspiration is to farm regeneratively, and that has not been my experience. I think it remains more profitable to extract natural and social capital from the planet and then not to pay the true costs of the damage done. So we have a dishonest and distorted economic system. than it does to farm properly regeneratively. And I think it's completely possible in a true cost accounted world. In the long run, it's probably more economically viable to farm in harmony with nature and to build the natural and social capital. But in order to make that true, you're going to have to put a lot of things right. So those estimates of trillions or whatever it is of dollars, euros, pounds to make the transition, I do think we have to find a lot of money. And by the way, while I've got the word, can I just big up my two co-panelists and say that I have had the great honour to show the now ex-chief executive of HSBC, Noel Quinn, round my farm a year and a half ago. And that was a great thing to do. And also Nestle are walking the talk. And we've just been discussing that here at this conference today with the project they're doing with First Milk in Cumbria and other places as well. So I think this is a great, trio to discuss these issues.
Patrick, coming back to your point about you need a lot of money. What needs to happen for that money to start flowing in the right direction?
Well, I think we need to sit down together, and I'm involved with a thing called the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which the then Prince of Wales, now King, set up at Davos in 2020. And he basically said, we're never going to do this transition, not just food and farming, but everything, in the time available, unless we involve the biggest companies in the world to go on the journey. I think he was right. And he pulled together these task forces, as they were known. And I'm heading one on measuring sustainability. But then we co-organized a cross-task force meeting of banking, food companies, retailers, utilities, asset managers, farmers and others, to look at how you could put together a coalition of people who would co-fund the transition. Because if the question is what is the cost, I think the very minimum cost would be to double the amount of subsidy we're currently getting. So I'm getting about £100 an acre annual subsidy on my farm in Wales. Although it has to be said that this morning on Farming Today, the new scheme has been launched. So, that may change. But if I could have another £100 from the industry, the people who would benefit from financing the transition in the long run, but put up the money up front, then I think that would create a business case for many more farmers to transition. And I think, HBS banks are part of that coalition, big food companies are part of that coalition, but even the two of them together can't do it alone. We need more than that.
Thank you,
and
Patrick.
We need to collaborate. It's got to be pre-competitive collaboration.
Yeah, definitely 100% agree with that. Katrina, I suppose coming to you, Patrick's talked there about money needs to flow in the right direction. Is that it? Are we starting to see that change happening? Do the banks understand that?
Yeah, I think we are, and I guess sort of going back to your original question about is it more profitable to farm extractively? I think we need to sort of challenge that assumption. I think one of the reasons that banks are and finance is starting to flow towards towards the food systems transition is because I think increasingly we're realizing that crop losses and price volatility due to climate change are a major financial risk, not just for farmers, but for food companies, for brands, for retailers, and for investors and banks. I think we can all see the effect on yields that weather is having. And, when you look at weather sensitive crops like wheat, maize, rice, that can be really quite acute. And I think, that volatility, drives supply side shocks, which drive up consumer prices, and that unpredictability is causing pain for everyone. In terms of financial resilience to farmers, both large and small, that's a real problem. And then that raises a credit risk, to people like banks. So everyone in the system, I think, is affected, by climate change. And therefore, we do know that the answer is to build more resilient farming systems, and to move away from extractive systems. So I think there is increasingly an understanding that it isn't necessarily more profitable over the longer term to farm in this extractive manner, and that we do need to move towards more regenerative practices because of the adaptation that offers, that resiliency that offers, not just because it's the right thing to do, not just because it reduces our Scope 3 emissions, and everyone's happy with reporting and disclosures. I think, it is about building sort of resiliency and that and reducing that volatility within the system. And I think that is why we're starting to see financial capital being allocated towards this. I'm not saying that is easy or happening really at the scale that it needs to yet, but I think we're seeing some really positive signs that is being factored into credit risk models or being factored into banks' decision lending criteria. So, for instance, in HSBC in the UK, we have a product called the Sustainable Farming Pathways. Our first partner with that is Leaf, but that is the first time that we've offered a loan to farming enterprises to invest across their whole enterprise, to invest in their sustainability and their resilience in a way that they see fit, in the knowledge that it may reduce yields over the short term, but over the longer term, we think it will build more resilient businesses. And therefore, that's the right thing to do from an environmental perspective, but also from an economic perspective, from a profitability perspective. And I think that's when we can line those things up that we really start to get that traction with capital flowing in the right direction. I'm not saying it's at the scale, like the scale that you were mentioning, Lou, 1 trillion a year, was it? I think you said from the WEF article. But there are some encouraging signs, is what I would say.
Great. And Owen, coming to you, one of the things, the word volatility and the kind of an expectation, it has been talked about a lot of times in the opening. The food industry, a lot of pressure at the moment. Probably never been tougher than it is to keep a food business kind of on the straight and narrow. Patrick referenced some of the brilliant work you guys are doing as Nestle. I suppose to get something off the ground like that within a big business like Nestle, what has had to change? What's the different mindset that you guys have adopted in order to start doing some good work?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity of being here today. So I think for Nestle, actually the journey, if you like, towards a more sustainable approach to sourcing our ingredients started a little bit longer ago, around 15 years ago, when we had a lot of external pressure on the topic of deforestation. And that came from, at the time, a very active civil society organization, campaign, which used some of our brands. And I think it really was quite impactful inside the company, because it made us reflect on what we were doing, how we were operating, and if there was a better way of doing what we do, continuing to deliver for consumers, but to actually address some of these issues in the supply chain through taking a more hands-on approach. And that resulted in us getting to a very high level of deforestation-free verified ingredients from some of those at-risk commodities like palm oil. And so that external pressure helped change the mindset internally at that point of time. And then on climate, there was a similar type of process, right? So we had the Paris Agreement, we had a huge amount of civil society and political pressure and momentum around net zero, that was more sort of 5-6 years ago. And that made us react to that and just put in place a very ambitious plan around reaching net zero emissions, including a big regen ag element. And so there was these sort of external shocks, if you like, made the company reflect and take big decisions and make strategic decisions, which were then kind of not reversible because they were, big changes of direction. And a lot of that direction came from the top of the company. So our former CEO was very clear that this was going to be a key way in which we would operate moving forwards. And our relatively new CEO is very much, continuing that with his message internally and externally around the power of regen ag, both in terms of improving supply chain resilience, but also in terms of just making a better and more robust system, which puts farmers at the center. So, I think that's the process we've gone through, and we've gone through, 2 or 3 big mentality shifts to get where we are today.
Nice, thank you. I suppose talking about that over a relatively long period of time, certainly longer than I expected. Patrick, coming back to you, we've talked about, or we're talking about this transition, this shift that's needed. I suppose from a farmer's perspective, what is it actually like trying to make that shift? And you spoke when we had a chat last week. You said, if farmers are going to be rewarded for doing the right thing, what actually is the right thing and what are they being paid for, and who define what does good look like? What does good mean? From your perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think, this might be a bit contentious, but I think the change that farmers need to make to be delivering positive public goods in terms of climate, nature, and social outcomes is inconveniently more radical than a lot of people hope, if I can put it that way. So I think there are a lot of arable farmers, and there's an SMI trial, actually, a pilot, called Financing the Agricultural Transition or something like that, under that banner of Financing the Agricultural Transition, which is involving mainly arable farmers in the east of England, not all in the east of England. And I would say that if the data is collected from that arable pilot, what will be learned will be that you can't do it with continuous arable farming. I mean, that's an annoying thing to say, because I think a lot of farmers would like to say that if they just do plant cover crops in the winter and carry on with a slightly modified rotation and turn down the dial on the pesticide and the fertilizer applicators, that could be regen delivered. And my concern is that it won't be, because I think you need a more radical change of practice to rebuild the lost soil carbon stocks, or indeed to replenish the biodiversity, which I'm old enough to remember used to coexist with food production back in the 1950s and 60s, but which doesn't any longer take place because the fields have become dead zones. So to your question, I think the farming practice which needs to become the norm to replace what we've got at the moment would be what I would call mixed farming, a farming with a crop rotation with a fertility building phase, probably half the rotation. That sounds really inconvenient, I imagine, meaning grass and clover, or what's known as a herbal lay, which could then lay down the carbon stocks, replenish the carbon stocks, and then followed by a succession of crops, perhaps a wheat or a potato crop, followed by a barley or an oat crop, and then you might fit a legume in as well, or vegetables, whatever you're going to grow. And that system would rebuild carbon in the soils. And it also would be likely to be nature friendly in terms of the in-crop biodiversity. Now, that is very inconvenient for a lot of mainly arable farmers, and they're going to look at that. And back to your opening point about how many trillions or billions it's going to cost to finance the transition, that's where the capital cost is. You're talking about a big change of farming practice. We've been at it 52 years. We are on a pretty marginal farm in Wales, half of which can't grow crops. So that's just permanent pasture, but we've got a dairy herd to graze that off. And then the other half is in a long rotation. But because our climate and our soils are quite challenging, we can only do 2 years of arable crops in a 7-year rotation. So we modeled all this in a report called Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, which we published a couple of years ago, which anybody watching this could download, looking at the impact of that adoption of that food system on output. And we found that actually some crops would dramatically reduce, like particularly grain crops. They reduced by 50%. And so grain would become a lot more expensive. And that would probably mean the end of cheap chicken, which would be one of the sort of undesirable consequences of a transition. But I think that's the reality. And not everyone will agree with what I've just said, but that's the way we do it. So we're growing carrots now for schools in West Wales. Carrots you can grow 1 year in 7. And, so it's a big change, this. So that justifies the money you referred to.
And I suppose for
by the way, a bit more information. One other thing, which is how are we doing it? We're producing a cheese which sells, the wholesale price of which is probably more than the retail price. Well, it's a cheddar of supermarket cheddar, and carrots. We're getting £1.60 a kilo for our carrots and interestingly enough, a big food distribution company is paying that premium effectively. So I think these big companies need to finance the transition out of their profits. That's what happened with the energy transition. I think it does need to happen with the farming transition as well, but not on their own, as I said.
And, for a farmer that wants to, adopt that inconvenient way of doing things, what's the incentive for them? What do they, what do we need to start happening? You talked a little bit about data there. You referenced data. What are some of the other things?
Yeah. So if people don't agree with what I've just said about short, continuous arable rotations not cutting the mustard, well, let's find out by measuring. So we need to measure the climate, nature, and social impacts of all farming systems and collect data for 5 years. And by the way, DEFRA ought to be doing that. They're not. The Welsh Government launched their sustainable farming scheme this morning, or yesterday. It was on Farming Today this morning. They're not measuring, and neither are the Scottish Government measuring. But we need to know which farming systems deliver the so-called public goods that Michael Gove called out and which don't. And to do that, we need to measure. And we need to measure using the same harmonized framework to collect this data. Then we'll find out what works and what doesn't. Then we'll also find out what monetary input it needs to finance the transition.
Yeah. You referenced climate, nature, and social benefits there. A question from the audience says that should we be also looking at nutrient density of products as well and rewarding farmers for any value there?
Yeah, so public health is a social benefit from regenerative farming systems, and we need a nutrient density and food safety are two of the factors which will deliver the public health. And if you listen to this week's Radio 4 food program, there's a man called Dan Kitteridge who founded the Bionutrient Association. He's from Massachusetts, and he was at an open farm weekend that we hosted last weekend in Wales. And he has developed a piece of kit which seems to be capable of measuring the nutrient density of different foods using photon emissions. And he was saying over last weekend that, and he's saying it on the food program as well, that if this could be taken to scale, it could be a game changer. Because if you, me, and anyone else who wants to buy good food could point a phone, he thinks it'll even be on our phone apps in not too short order, you could find out that, imagine my carrots were more nutrient dense. That would justify the premium. And at the moment, a carrot is a carrot is a carrot, and people are not sure whether there's a difference.
Yeah. And Katrina, coming to you, certainly when data's in play, data can point to something being true, and we can minimize risk. All of those things are good for banks. Would you agree with that point that Patrick's talked about there, about how we need to capture the data, therefore we can measure what's true and reward it in the right way? I suppose it's part of the first question. And then 10 minutes ago or so, you started to talk about some of the great work HSBC are doing. What have you seen from financing some of this transition that really works? What are some of the things you've been learning?
Okay, all right. So if I take the data question, I think, yeah, data is important, and there's more and more sort of tech solutions that are coming online, whether it's measuring carbon or biodiversity or methodologies or agreed upon definitions, like, for example, the SAI platform for regenerative practices. All of those standards that we can verify allow finance to flow. We can't, we have to be really careful that we are funding things that genuinely result in the environmental outcomes that we're looking for, because often our products are, the difference between a green product and a regular product is that we're reducing the cost of capital, like either reducing interest rates or looking at other financial mechanisms that allow us to reduce the cost of capital to incentivize the move towards more sustainable practices or more resilient practices, for instance. So data is important. I'm quite optimistic because I think that there's lots of really interesting tech solutions that are coming out, you know, whether it's from data metrics or, you know, satellite imagery or LiDAR to look at carbon in the soil. And incidentally, you know, we also bank those kind of clients as well because we have an innovation bank that looks at those early stage climate tech companies. So, you know, we can see the continuum. So I'm quite excited and optimistic about that. And I think Patrick's absolutely right. We do need the data. We need to know what we're doing actually results in the outcome that we want to see, not just rewarding people for doing an activity. And then your second question, I think, was it was around what do I see in terms of financial mechanisms that are most promising towards helping the transition? Is that right?
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, are there any good examples that you guys have been working on that you can talk about?
Yeah. So I've already talked about the sustainable farming pathway. So I would kind of consider that as a very important tool, but it's around you know, reducing the cost of capital, like green linked loans, essentially. But there are there are other mechanisms that are coming online that are very interesting and sort of talk to how we can work across the supply chain and how we can share risk across many actors within it. So one of the things we're looking at is co-investment models and really building on our strength as sort of a trade bank, a global trade bank. We offer supply chain financing, and for those that don't know, you know, what it is and how that kind of can apply to ag, because it's quite a fast evolving space. Essentially, at its very simplest form, it's kind of a mechanism where we can use like the buyer, the off-taker's creditworthiness, that could be a food brand or a retailer, to de-risk the lending to their supply chain, to their farmers, to their producers. And that, you know, enables access to finance at a rate that they may never be able to, you know, a participant in the supply chain wouldn't necessarily be able to access. And therefore it acts as an incentive for those suppliers to move to those practices. It's kind of a win-win for everyone. The off-taker gets an assured supply, they get the practice that they want, the recipient of the loan also gets the reduced cost of capital, and it should be a continuous circle, right? A virtuous circle, but it is actually incredibly complex to do in agricultural supply chains because they're long and complex and fragmented. But we've got some examples of where we've been using that mechanism alongside sort of some blended finance, and that's sort of like impact finance that has a different, like a requirement for return or a different risk appetite than commercial lending would allow you to do, because you know, banks are highly regulated. We have to operate in certain rules, and there's certain things that we cannot do because of those rules. But you know, if we can work in this collaborative way with the off-taker, with the supply chain, with some concessional finance, suddenly we can, you know, allow finance to flow to places maybe it wouldn't have flowed to, and at a reduced rate. So I think those models are really exciting, and we're seeing them. I'll give an example of one we've worked on in India. So we work with the Agri3 Fund in India, which is it's an impact investor. It's backed by the Swiss and the Dutch government, and we've worked with them where they provide some catalytic capital as a guarantee. In a financial structure, and we also work with microfinancing institutes, local banks that are able to bank the smallholder farmer in India that we would never be able to reach as a big global bank, and we're able then to provide small loans, and in this case it's to female farmers in India that are doing climate smart agriculture, and as a result, we've been able to increase sort of like financial inclusion for those farmers, which has a massive impact. They're a bloody good book. They don't default. They're brilliant. And through a technical assistance program, which I think is another key thing to work across the supply chain, they're able to then have more resilient practices and invest in them where previously they would never have been able to do that. And I think mechanisms like that, when you couple that with an off-taker, offer some really exciting opportunities to kind of give that scale, move beyond the pilot phase.
Yeah.
So I think they're really, really exciting. I think the other thing I'll mention, which, that Patrick talked about, which I think is really important, it's about, how do we use different revenue streams, whether it be carbon or emerging nature markets, so that we can actually, pay people or reorientate finance so that we're paying for the things or valuing the things that we actually want the food system to do, which is, healthy ecosystems, secure food and livelihood. So it's all of those things, not just one of them, not just yields at any cost, but other aspects of that. And I think that there's some really interesting financing options that, we did an outcome bond with the World Bank for reforestation in the Amazon, and there is so much you could do with carbon and or nature when nature markets scale. So I think that's another really exciting area for finance, but probably a bit out there at the moment.
All good examples and lots in there. I definitely agree with the point about the wraparound kind of training and skill support. It's only getting the money into the right place is only half of it. People have got to know what to do with it.
Absolutely.
We're getting some good questions from the audience. Please do keep sending them in, and I'm going to start asking a few in a moment. But Owen, coming to you next. You talked in your opening comments about the fact this has been 15 or so year journey for you guys. Patience is clearly an attribute that you've got in bucket loads. I suppose talk to us. I think when people think about maybe doing food in the right way or transitioning the food industry or regenerative, Nestle might not be top of the list of companies that they think of. So, please tell the audience about some of the brilliant work you've been doing, and maybe some of the examples if you can. I think that'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think from a Nestle perspective, we actually went out with one of the boldest commitments in the first wave of food companies committing to regenerative agriculture, and that was to transition 50% of our key ingredients by 2030 to some form of regenerative production. And the good news is we're actually slightly ahead of target on that. At the end of 2024, we were about 21% of our ingredients sourced from some kind of regen practice. And I think a point to say there is that doesn't mean that those farms are fully mature, fully regenerative, but it does mean that they're on the journey. And that can involve farmer training, it can involve technical support, it can involve investment of some form coming from Nestle. And it can take the form of new economic models, which actually boost livelihoods without actually necessarily directly affecting the offtake producer relationship, if that makes sense. So you're actually helping farmers produce more, which might not be actually something that Nestle buys, right? So an example would be coffee farmers in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. They plant a lot of black pepper now in between their coffee trees because that's an additional revenue stream. We don't need that much black pepper, so we can't buy it all, but there are other companies that do want to buy that. And so that can actually help boost incomes by over 100% and provide a more stable revenue stream over the course of the year, which coffee may not provide. And coffee is also, very much vulnerable to climate risks and shocks as well, as you can see in the prices of coffee on global markets at the moment. So coffee is a really good example. We're at about actually almost a third of our coffee sourcing now is coming from Regen Ag globally, and that's for brands like Nescafe and Nespresso, who've long been doing work with farmers. So for those brands, it was a bit more of a natural transition. They just had to scale up and do more in different parts of the world. For some other brands, it was a bit of a newer concept. If you think about cereals, for example, where we'd maybe not had that direct relationship with the farmers previously, and we've done more of just the role of purchaser. So now we're embedding it into different commodities in different countries. Cocoa is another good example where agroforestry can be quite rapidly scaled. It's also relatively cost efficient, so that's a euphemism for affordable. And so we also see a very strong business case coming from the resilience perspective there, with cocoa prices going through the ceiling. And as a big confectionery company, that's a major financial risk. So the business case sort of proves itself through the impact on operations that we're seeing already. So coffee and cocoa are going really well. Cereals are making progress. And then if we also look at dairy, that's actually our biggest source of emissions, perhaps unsurprisingly. But there's a lot we can do there too, in terms of improving efficiency, improving farmer training, access to technology, and we have many different types of sourcing environments. So that ranges from very developed models where efficiency may be very high, but there's things that we can do around feed or manure management, through to more developing countries where there's a big gap between how much they produce and how much they could produce with the right support. And then that reduces the carbon intensity, increases security of supply, and it helps make sure that the different actors in the supply chain all benefit. So there's lots of different programs covering our key ingredients, and as I said, making a lot of progress. I think the next stage is to explore what Katrina set out there, which is a different way of financing all of this. So we've invested quite a significant amount since 2021 into Regen Ag. It's more than 1 billion Swiss francs. And that money has helped kick off hundreds of pilots around the world. But now to really get that to scale, we need to look at the biggest lever we have, which is our purchasing, right? Our market player power. And that's why we're looking at ways of bringing in external finance based around our own creditworthiness, our own offtake power, to actually unlock more resources for farmers in more countries.
Nice. I think we're going to come back maybe to Katrina in a few minutes and talk about some of those kind of collaborative and more innovative models. But Owen, you used the word efficiency quite a lot in your answer there, which I thought was really interesting. And you also talked about where you're helping farmers kind of figure out ways they can sell more. And one of my reflections from working across the industry is that people often see this big bucket of sustainability as the center of cost. They don't see that if you do it right, it can either help you do things better and therefore save money, or find more value and make more money. I suppose you guys have figured that out. What, long term, what do you think the risk is? And certainly in an inflationary environment, I think people are standing still on some of these topics. What is the risk to a business of doing nothing, of kind of inaction, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a real question mark around how far and how fast you go on this, right? So for some companies, there might be a temptation to either leave certain economic sectors because they're becoming too risky, or to try and chase supply in other places where you may then deliver an additional negative impact if that's not handled correctly. And I think it's important to resist that temptation and to say, okay, let's play a bit of a longer game here. And I'll use the example again of deforestation. So as we learned more about deforestation, it became clear that a lot of the risks were really social risks, right? So it was smallholder producers who were pushed into more marginal areas by larger plantations. I'm talking here about palm oil. And they were suffering because they were on the poverty line, right? So if you're on the poverty line, you need to survive. And to do that, you might need to expand your area of production, or you're forced to by being moved into a new area. So instead of sort of saying, let's just get rid of those people from our supply chain, the better action is to say, how do we work with them, or the people putting the pressure on them to reduce it, and to actually look at livelihoods as the driving factor there. And I think on Regen Ag, it's a similar thing, right? So if in the longer term farming becomes completely unprofitable, no one's going to have any supply, right, including Nestle. And so we need to communicate clearly the value of taking a long-term approach, and to say to investors, go with us on this. Think about this as a longer term play. And as a 165-year-old company, we do have a certain amount of credibility in making that argument, to say we've been around a long time, we want to be around for another 165 years at least, if we can. And to do that, you need to give us the leeway to invest in these new models, and also to think about how we actually reorganize our purchasing and our supply chains in a way that helps deliver much greater resilience.
Great, thank you. Quite a lot of questions coming in on the chat about the consumer. I was reading the Grocer this morning. Surprise jump in inflation in the UK. I think about 3.6%, unexpected, largely driven by fuel and food prices. I believe. Couple of the questions, from the audience are saying we're talking a lot about the farmer, about the supply chain, about manufacturers. We haven't talked about the consumer yet. And actually, I suppose, Patrick, maybe come to you first. What is the true cost of transition of the food industry? And, are we going to expect the consumer to pay more for food?
Well, obviously, everyone should have the right to high quality, safe, nutritionally dense food at affordable prices. And for that to be made possible, several strands of this conversation need to be actioned. Financing agricultural transition would, if I got the money, if I was paid to be a carbon steward for my soils, a nature steward for my in-crop biodiversity, and a social steward, which is really interesting that Nestle are considering the social cost or benefit of agriculture for my education, because we're hosting lots of school visits and Noel Quinn visits and other influencers are available, all that sort of thing. And also for my employment, we employ loads of people. Back to the sort of smallholder coffee producers, that's a positive social impact. So it seems to be we must include measuring the social impacts as well as climate and nature, because then once we've measured them, we can monetize them and then we can reward them. And then I'm a cheese producer, which is definitely the price at which is out of reach of big supermarkets or big food companies. But if I was paid to be a carbon nature and social steward, then maybe I could charge less for my cheese. So what is that cost? Well, I'm very simply, this is absolutely not scientific, but if I got another £100 an acre from those three pots of money from various sources, not just a bank and a food company, but others as well, I think that would bring transition in the orbit of many, many more farmers throughout the world. Because at the moment we're getting £100 an acre subsidy from the Welsh government in my case. And if you doubled that for a transition payment in various kinds that I mentioned, that would be a game changer. One other point I just wanted to make that come up in the conversation, very interesting that the cattle issue has come up with Nestle, and that you said that they're your highest emitters. Well, I want to challenge that. Cows have had very bad press, mainly because of their methane emissions. But 2 points. One is that we won't have an agricultural transition without livestock, because only livestock can turn the forage of the fertility building phase of the rotation into food that we can eat. And secondly, it's not the cow, but the how, meaning that if you have a fully housed, concentrate fed dairy herd that never gets out to grass, that is a really bad carbon footprint. But if you have a mainly grass-fed dairy herd that is regeneratively grazed, I would even go so far as to say that that system of dairy production would be carbon negative. And if that proves to be the case by the collection of data, then actually cows are part of the solution, because only ruminant animals in a proper crop rotation can rebuild the lost carbon that we've extracted from our soils over the last century. So, summary, there's a lot to learn from data collection. And also on the consumer, I believe that this data ought to form a sustainability score, which could be on product labels. So imagine I went in and it had a sustainability score on it, and that sustainability score was divided into the climate, nature, and social benefits of the product. And then I could look at the Nestle cheese or whatever it was, doesn't matter what it was, and compare that with, say, my organic cheese. I mean, I might have a lower score, but at least I want to know that. And I think citizens as consumers have the right to know the sustainability story behind the food that they purchase. I think if they had it and they trusted, that would drive the transition we all want to see.
Owen, anything, I think the point there about labeling is an interesting one, but kind of any thoughts on Patrick's comments?
Yeah, well, first of all, the it's not the cow, it's the how comment. I mean, I'm referring here to the rules that we have to follow in terms of our greenhouse gas accounting, as you know, dairy being the largest source of emissions. You know, that's what the current external stakeholder environment expects us to do. So that's what we're doing. But I agree with his points there. I think on the consumer journey, the way we started off with that was to think about it as a kind of value add attribute. So you could sort of, you know, and this is a few years ago, you know, you could charge more for a regeneratively grown product, or you could, you know, add a premium on. And I think there's been a reflection on that more recently to say that's not really the point. The point is to add an additional reason for the consumer to love your brands, right? And in a very competitive environment, that's really important, and that has a very strong value in its own right. So if you look at a campaign we did in the UK on KitKat, it was called Breaks for Good. And that was all about the social impact that some of our programs are having in West Africa. And it wasn't sort of fundamentally changing the brand proposition, but it was a specific campaign which allowed us to reach more people, right? And so brands love that. And so we want to do much more of that with all of our key brands to say, what's your reason to believe in Milo or Nespresso or Nescafe, based around the sustainability story and the other things that people love, the taste, etc. But you know, to give it sort of like another string to their bow, to our brands to communicate. And so I think it's less about sort of saying, let's try and get consumers to pay. It's more about how do we make sure that they reward Nestle for the things that they love about Nestle, which now includes sustainability as well.
Can I come back briefly on that?
Yeah.
Just to say, I think one point about the labeling. I think that's so great, and also Mark Schneider, when was CEO of Nestle, he made that same point that, you know, Nestle consumers need to know the social benefit, for instance, of your coffee producers, because actually right livelihood and keeping them on the land is a social benefit. The other thing to say is just to agree with you strongly about the way in which carbon emissions from cows are currently calculated. I mean, the UK Climate Change Committee is advocating a reduction in ruminant animals because they're using the wrong way of measuring. And that's a really important point to make, because it's led to an enormous amount of confusion amongst all strands of society. The cow has been demonized. And I think we should, in the same way as we differentiate between the cows that are part of the problem and the cows that are part of the solution, we do the same with plants. There's terrible industrial plant production systems which are causing massive damage, dare I say it, including palm oil. And we need to, there may be such a thing as sustainable palm oil, but it's not mostly the case. So we need to be as tough on plants as we are on animals, and purchase food accordingly.
There we go. Thank you, Patrick. Katrina, I want to come back to you on some of the points we were talking about of financing. You know, collaboration has been quite a strong theme, I think, from everybody. You know, you used the phrase shared risk earlier on. Like, how difficult is it to make stuff like that happen? Is it starting to happen?
I think the short answer is yes, it's really, really difficult. But I hand on heart believe that we have to use these collaborative models. It's the only way in which we can get the commercial capital to flow at the level it needs to scale the transition not only at the scale, but also at the pace it needs to happen. So yes, it is very difficult, and the place that we're at the moment with these kind of co-investment models where you've got some concessional capital, whether that's from the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or an impact investor, where you've got capital from commercial lenders, where you've got a supply chain actor like a Nestle signing longer term offtake agreements and using their creditworthiness, where you've got multiple of them coming together, or different actors along the supply chain, to reduce that cost of capital to a farmer in a geographical region. It could be India, it could be the UK, it could be Brazil. Those things are possible and they're happening, but at the moment everything is bespoke and being built. So what we need to get to is like a product that exists, we know works, that we know delivers the outcomes that we want to deliver over the longer term, that we can just kind of replicate, and then it becomes business as usual. We're kind of almost there, but not quite there, is what I would say. But I think that I'll be interested to hear what Owen thinks about that, because that's something that we talk about a lot. But these are, well, I think, I believe, and where the models that will scale, but I think they need to be simple and replicable.
Yeah, Owen, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I kind of feel like we're really on the cusp of quite a significant change in the way that we, our relationship with banks and finance organizations, and to, as I said before, to kind of leverage this power that we have to get more finance flowing into the supply chain. But that requires a bit of a mindset shift. There's still a tendency to value flexibility and agility, to use another buzzword, when it comes to procurement. So people buying ingredients want to be able to change if certain things happen, and that's understandable. But I think we also need to look at what's the cost of doing that longer term. This cost of inaction point, and therefore move in the direction of actually having a really honest and thoroughly worked out conversation about that, to say, if you don't go in that direction, the profitability and the security of your investment is going to decline in the long term rather than increase. And I'd really love to just sort of get the facts on the table there and say, look at what's happening in coffee and cocoa, and look at what we're doing as a company to address some of those issues.
Exactly.
We need more of that, not less of it. Not sort of a knee-jerk reaction in the direction of more flexibility because of these price spikes. So I think during London Climate Week, I think myself and Katrina saw each other about 15 times at different events, because there's a huge amount of discussion going on here, with food companies and banks, and we're not quite there yet. I think there's still a bit of a push needed to change a few mindsets, but that's maybe the next big disruption, right? So I talked about changing on traceability. So deforestation was all about traceability. Regen Ag is all about farmer engagement, and now finance is all about kind of changing procurement behaviors. And I think maybe that's the next big change that we need to see and deliver.
I think at the core of that, though, is people, is humans, and changing human behavior. So coming back to that point of collaboration, lots more of this. Talking around the topic is important. We're getting tight on time. I've got one more audience question and then one final question for our panelists before I hand back over. Question from Fernando. I'm not sure who would like to answer this, but what are your thoughts on a potential future role for carbon taxes in the food industry? Should we consider a carbon tax on high emission food supply chains to reflect the real cost of carbon intensive food products, rather than letting their environmental impact go unpriced? Anyone want to have a thought on that?
I can make a initial comment on that. So there was a lot of interest last year in what they did in Denmark by introducing a carbon tax on the livestock industry, on dairy, in fact. And what's interesting there is that it's designed to be an incentive, right? So over time, you would not pay that tax by reducing your emissions, by investing in certain practices and improvements in your farming system. I think if it's designed properly and actually is a net gain for the farmer, who engages, then there's no problem with that, right? But it shouldn't be a punishment for just making a living. I think this is very much the wrong way to go. And I think also my other comment would be that, politically, I think it's a difficult argument to make, especially if there's a sort of inflationary effect short term from those types of taxes. I think that's really going to be quite a hard sell. So I think it's better to look at it more as you might not want to call it a carbon tax. You might want to call it an incentive system to decarbonize, which is a net gain for the farmer at the end of the process.
Can I comment on that as well?
Yeah.
Well, I think Owen's put his finger on it. Basically, it needs to be properly designed, and the Danes didn't. They didn't differentiate between different kinds of livestock systems, and there was no carrot. So you want a carrot and a stick, and the stick has got to be correctly designed. So if you have some ruminant animals that are part of the solution, they should be rewarded. And you could do that in the form of soil carbon sequestration. And the stick needs to be accurately allocated to the farmers that are causing a big climate problem. and neither was done properly. So correct design is key. And then I think it is right in essence to have a carbon market, both carrots and sticks, because if you don't measure and value something, then it's invisible. And on goes extractive agriculture, which is what's going on at the moment. So the principle of applying the polluter pays principle along with the corresponding carrot is key, I think, to get the transition going. It's not popular with governments. Again, Owen intimated this because of food pricing, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. Another wonderful insight, of which we've had very many today. Another 18 questions in the chat that we're not going to get through. So I've got one final question for our panelists before I hand back over. Big question, but I'm looking for kind of short answers, I think. Katrina, we're going to come to you first. If we could redesign the food finance system today, what is the thing that we need to change first?
I think it's around incentives. So I think we need to redesign the incentives so it isn't just about yields, but it's more about secure food supply chains. It's more about healthy ecosystems. It's more about resilient livelihoods. And that those financial products, one more thing about it, the match the ag realities. So I think that we have to look, the timeframes for some of these products are too short. So we have to look at different tenors. You know, these are long-term investments that deliver outcomes over the longer term. So yeah, that's what I would say. Tenor and incentives.
Thank you. Incentives. Owen.
So I would really love it if we had big institutional investors, asking some questions to Nestlé about how important it was for them that we invested in regenerative agriculture throughout our supply chains from a long-term profitability and security perspective for them as the owners of the company, right? So we're employees. We have some people have some shares, but the vast majority of shares are held by big pension funds or big investment vehicles. And I think it would be really great if they actually worked out what's the cost of inaction, came to us and said, like, we think what you're doing is fantastic. In fact, maybe we should have a little bit more of that because we can start to see that long-term case coming through. And I think that's the real key enabler, right? Because then that gives you that license to do things differently. So more active stewardship from the owners of companies would be great.
Stewardship is a good word. I like that word. Patrick.
Well, I agree with what Owen just said. I had a Zoom call with some BlackRock people quite recently, and I said, what's your position on investing in or in carbon, nature, and social credits or their equivalent, so that this transition finance gets mobilized? And I mean, this is a truncated answer, but they basically said we don't trust the data enough. It's the Wild West out there with carbon credits, especially in the US, dare I say it. And when we trust the data more, we'll come in. And I think that's our challenge. We need to make sure that the way we measure and harmonize, I believe, because there's too much different measurement systems around at the moment, needs to be sorted out, made more holistic and made more accurate. And then I think the investment community will come in.
Great. Patrick, thank you. Thank you to all of the panelists. A fascinating conversation. Some of the big words I've scribbled down as takeaways. You've got stewardship, lots more collaboration, a huge focus on data, the right incentives, and I think most of all, a lot of patience was a big takeaway for me. Jared, I think it's back to you.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. Thank you, Katrina, Owen, Patrick. That was a really insightful conversation. I think we could keep going easily for another hour. And to all the audience who are there posing your questions, thank you so much. We'll be running a variety more webinars in the coming months until the conference. So a quick thank you, virtual round of applause to everyone, and we will see you soon. Take care, everyone. And thank you, of course, to you, Louis. How could I forget?
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.